Hello guys, my name is Lars Stender. I'm a science fiction and fantasy writer from Denmark. And I'm here today to read from my book Mandigo and the Hellhounds, which is a fantasy story about a young kid, a young boy who becomes trained as a magician. If you want to know more about my stories and my books, you are welcome to visit my website www.simon.net, or you can also click into the Facebook page Lars A Stender, which tells you more about my work and stories. Now, for the Mandigo and Hellhounds, Chapter 6. The sound penetrated his whole being, and Mandigo felt his knees grow weak. He fell down in the tall grass with his hands pressed against his ears, but a horrible sound managed to cut right into his eardrum and all the way into his mind. Bellatrix started to cry, and the deer she had been playing with jumped away in panic. The last leaves of the tree fell on the grass, and the glades shrank and looked like corkscrews. Ferns and bushes curled up as though the coldest frost had bitten them. The black creatures landed with the sound of cracking whip. The whirled around the glade and screeched so loud that Mandigo finally didn't know what was up and down or what was hard or soft or left and right. Through the infernal sound of the creatures he heard Bellatrix scream despairingly. To his horror, he discovered that one of the creatures had sunk its claws into her and was trying to pull her up from the ground and fly away with her. With his heart pounding, he tried to get to his feet, but could continuously be knocked down by one of the creatures. The next moment, a violent whirlwind hit the glade. The winged creatures were tossed here and there as though they were nothing but loose-limbed rag dolls, and the roar of the whirlwind managed to drown out their shrill shrieks. To Mandigo's great surprise, the whirlwind did not seem to have any effect on the ground he lay on. He looked around confusedly. He discovered Greta standing outside her cottage, swinging her cane above her head while she made a similar rotating movement with her forefinger. Her eyes shone like burning sapphires, and her long white hair rippled about her head like a foam on big ocean waves splashing against the rocky coast. Mandigo heard Bellatrix scream once again. When he looked in her direction, he immediately became aware that the winged creature who had got hold of her was not planning on letting her go, despite the fact that Greta's whirlwind had managed to spread its fellows to the four corners of the world. It was, in fact, about to take off with Bellatrix, who was already a meter off the ground. Mandigo looked desperately around him for a weapon of some sort. He caught sight of a small stone on the ground. It wasn't much, but it was all there was in the immediate vicinity. Without a moment's hesitation, he picked up the stone, got up, and flung it with all his might at the atrocious winged creature. The stone wasn't big enough to do any serious damage, but Mandigo envisioned, in his mind's eye, transforming the stone into a flaming hot ball of fire that would kill the creature. And then a miracle happened. Halfway in its course towards the creature, Mandigo's stone changed into a white glowing meteor that entered the monster that had taken Bellatrix and blew it into 1,000 pieces. Bellatrix tumbled to the ground, whereupon the last of the winged creatures gave up their attack and flew off in a disorganized and considerably smaller pack. Mandigo stared awestruck at the place where his ball of fire had killed one of the ugly creatures. He couldn't fathom what had happened. Then he heard Bellatrix sniffling. "Bellatrix!" Mandigo shouted worriedly as he ran over to see whether anything happened to the little girl. She lay in a heap on the ground, all curled up when he reached her. Instinctively, he put his arms around her, and she pressed herself against his chest and cried loudly as he held her. Greta rushed towards him and immediately began to examine Bellatrix for any cuts and bruises. She had got a few scratch marks on her shoulders and upper arms where the beast's claws, and some of them were bleeding, but luckily they didn't look very deep. Still, Greta was worried. She got Mandigo to carry Bellatrix into the cottage, where she began to treat Bellatrix's wounds. The claws could have been poisonous, he said to Mandigo at one point, after she had put up some fresh water to boil at the hearth. The wounds must be carefully cleansed, and I will have to make a bandage of herbs that can neutralize the possible poisoning. What kind of creatures were those? Asked Mandigo, whose heart was still pounding in his chest over the shock of the unexpected attack. He started shaking all over his body as a reaction to what had happened, and Greta's cottage began to spin before his eyes, so he had to sit down on the floor for a brief moment. "They're called Swallows," answered Greta, who was hectically rummaging through all her drawers and shelves to gather herbs and minerals for the bandage. "Swallows are said to have been born during the storm, and are in league with the Lord of Shadows." She stopped for a moment and made a sign of protection in front of her before carrying on with the final remaining ingredients. Mandigo looked up quickly when Greta mentioned the Lord of Shadows. It made him think of the legend about the elf girl Bellatrix and the warrior Zardan and the evil wizard who wanted to ruin their love for each other. His gaze returned to the little girl lying on the bed, whom he and Greta had named after the elf girl. Mandigo hadn't realized how much he had come to care for Bellatrix before one of the Trollocs had tried to kidnap her. She had become something of an extra little sister to him, and he felt responsible for her in more ways than one. But if the Trollocs really were in league with the Lord of Shadows, then might it just have been a coincidence that one of them had gone directly after Bellatrix and not him, Mandigo? Or had there been something else behind it? "Why do you think they attacked us?" he asked, in a low voice, fearing the answer. Greta took a specific bread box out and placed it on the table in the middle of the kitchen before she answered. "I don't know for sure, but maybe it was something to do with Bellatrix," Mandigo concluded. Greta froze in the middle of a movement and gave Mandigo an earnest gaze. Then she sighed and nodded slowly. "Yes, I'm afraid of that too." She turned her gaze toward Bellatrix, who still lay whimpering in bed. Mandigo could feel a shiver run through his spine. Greta, too, had thought about a possible connection between the Lord of Shadows and Bellatrix. "I've never been so afraid before," he admitted quietly, as he sat with his arms around his knees. He looked up at Greta with admiration and veneration in his gaze. If it hadn't been for you, then I didn't know how powerful your gift actually is until today. You were the one who started with the whirlwind, weren't you?" Greta gave a tired smile. Mandigo thought that she suddenly looked old somehow. She had, of course, also looked old before, but it had been in a different way. Before the Trollocs had attacked them, she had radiated vitality and sheer energy. Now she seemed small and grey. "Yes, that was me. It's been a long, long time since I've had to draw on my gifts so hard. I had almost forgotten how hard it is. But there is no need for you to belittle yourself. You were the one who saved Bellatrix with your fireball. I was truly impressed." "I just don't understand it," said Mandigo sincerely. "Just before, out in the meadow, I could barely get a thistledown to stand still in there, and then suddenly—" He didn't finish his sentence, but stared confusedly about him. Greta's smile turned to a crooked grin as she opened the unusual bread box and took out its contents. There was a special bread that Mandigo had seen her bake every once in a while, but which she never ate. Instead, she always kept it out until it began to spoil. "I think it was the seriousness of the situation that got your gift to work. You had to do something to save Bellatrix, and so subconsciously you gave your gift the freedom it needed. But come here, your water is boiling, and you have to help me clean Bellatrix's wounds." Mandigo held Bellatrix by the hand and consoled her while Greta cleansed her wounds and covered them with a bandage consisting of a mixture of herbs, including nettles, dandelions, aloe, and chamomile, self-heal, woundwort, and plantain. "Stay with her while I prepare antidote," Greta mumbled as she went back to the kitchen table. She took the mouldy bread lying on it and scraped off some of the stuff into the small tray of a birch bark. Then she fetched some tea from a mug that was standing next to the hearth and mixed the tea leaves with the mold. She poured the mixture into a small mortar and crushed it into a greenish powder that smelled somewhat musty. Then she took some more tea and poured it into a tin mug that she filled halfway up with warm water. She let the tea draw for a bit before she sieved the tea leaves out. She added a little bit of honey and let it cool before finally pouring green powder with a musty smell into the tea, which she then brought over to Bellatrix. Are you able to sit up, Bella? She asked the girl, who almost completely stopped crying now. Bellatrix nodded timidly, and with Mandigo's help she sat up. Be a good girl and drink this. The tea may not taste as good as the one you usually get, but it will help you sleep, and when you wake up again, your wounds won't hurt nearly as much as they do now. Bellatrix tasted the tea, made a face, but still managed to empty most of the contents after a while. Then she sank back into Mandigo's arms, and little by little her eyes grew heavy and she finally dozed off into a troubled dream. Why did you give her moldy bread? Mandigo asked, in order quietly not to wake Bellatrix. Not moldy bread, just the mold, Grace answered as she affectionately stroked Bellatrix's fair locks. But it's not like the mold that you and I know from bread that's gone stale. This is something special. It's from a recipe I once found in one of my trips to Suara. The mold is really a fungus that helps the body protect itself against infection and disease. Suara? Mandigo asked. Greta would sometimes teach him geography, where she'd tell him about great and mighty empires far away. The world was much, much bigger than Mandigo had ever been able to imagine before he started getting lessons from Greta, and he longed to set off on a journey to discover those foreign lands. Suddenly he became worried. Do Sroloks also live in Suara? Sroloks. And worse things too, Greta answered as she got up, tired, from the bed where Bellatrix was sleeping. She went over to the hearth where the pot of water still hung as it simmered. There was a hard expression about her lips, and her eyes shone with the glow of fire from the anger that was not characteristic for her as she bent down over the pot and waved the steam away. She took some crushed acacia from a leather bag in her belt and poured it into the water. It's about time that we found out what's going on, and who sent those Sroloks.